The blizzard of 1878 didn't just hit the San Juan Mountains, it tried to erase them. For Ethan Miller, a 24-year-old homesteader with calloused hands and a heart still raw from burying his father, the storm felt personal. It felt like a judgment. The wind screamed down the chimney of his half-finished cabin like a banshee, carrying temperatures that could snap a man's will as easily as a frozen branch. Ethan stood by the frosted windowpane, watching the world turn into a swirling vortex of white violence. He was miles from the nearest settlement, isolated in a territory that was beautiful in the summer but utterly murderous in the winter. And he was alone. This was supposed to be their fresh start. Ethan and his father, fresh from the disappointments of the East, had come to Colorado to carve a life out of the timber and stone. But the frontier took his father with a fever in September, leaving Ethan to face the approaching winter with a larder that was only half full and a cabin that still leaked drafts through the chinking. He had one thing, though, one luxury that separated him from the biting, lethal cold, a heavy, double-woven virgin wool blanket. He'd traded his father's pocket watch for it in Denver, a decision that felt frivolous then, but felt like divine intervention now. That blanket was thick as a bear's pelt, smelling of lanolin and safety. It was the only reason he slept at night without waking up with frost in his beard. The temperature plummeted. By Ethan's estimation, it was 20 below zero and dropping. The fire in the hearth was roaring, consuming his woodpile at a terrifying rate, but the heat died 3 feet from the flames. Ethan pulled the wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, shivering. He was calculating how long his wood would last, maybe a week if he was careful. When he heard it, it wasn't the wind. It was a dull, heavy thud against the rough-hewn logs of his door. Ethan froze. His hand instinctively went to the heavy iron latch, then stopped. His father's voice echoed in his memory, sharp and paranoid. "You don't open the door in a storm, boy. Not for God, not for the devil. Anything out there in this weather is either dead or looking to kill you to stay alive." This was Ute and Apache territory. Relations were tense. Outlaws used these storms to ambush isolated homesteads. Ethan grabbed the Spencer carbine from above the mantel, his knuckles white. He waited. Another sound, a scratch, and then a noise that cut through the howling wind and the fear in his gut. A whimper. It was high, weak, and unmistakably human. It wasn't the growl of a predator or the shout of a bandit. It was the sound of a life fading out. Ethan looked at the rifle, then at the door. He cursed under his breath. A prayer and a profanity rolled into one and through the latch. The wind blasted the door inward, hitting him with a wall of snow and ice that blinded him instantly. He squinted against the gale, looking down. There, collapsed on his porch, half buried in a drift that was forming in seconds, was a heap of frozen doeskin. It was a woman. An Apache woman. She was curled into a fetal ball, her skin a terrifying shade of blue-gray, her black hair matted with ice crystals. She wasn't moving. She wasn't even shivering anymore. A sign that the end was minutes away. The frontier code said to leave her. She was the enemy. She was a mouth he couldn't feed, a danger he didn't understand. But Ethan didn't see an enemy. He saw a girl, no older than himself, dying on his doorstep. He dropped the rifle. He reached down, grabbing her under the arms. She was light, terrifyingly light, like a bird made of hollow bones. He dragged her inside and kicked the door shut, latching it against the fury outside. The silence of the cabin returned, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the woman's ragged, shallow breathing. Ethan knelt beside her. The doeskin dress was frozen solid. It was sucking the heat out of her. He had to get her warm, and he had to do it now. He stripped the frozen leathers from her arms and legs, wincing at the sight of her skin, mottled, waxy, the dark signs of severe frostbite creeping across her fingers and toes. He dragged her closer to the fire, but it wasn't enough. The drafts along the floor were deadly. She needed insulation. She needed immediate, heavy warmth to trap whatever body heat she had left. Ethan looked at his bed. He looked at the heavy virgin wool blanket. His only blanket? If he gave it to her, he would have nothing but his thin coat and the dying fire. He knew the woodpile was low. He knew the drafty cabin temperature would drop to lethal levels tonight. Giving her that blanket wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a gamble with his own life. He looked at her face, serene, almost peaceful in the grip of hypothermia, and he knew he couldn't watch her die. With a shaking hand, he grabbed the blanket. He wrapped her in it, folding the thick wool layers over her, tucking it under her body, creating a cocoon of warmth. He lifted her head gently and placed his only pillow beneath it. Then the cold came for him. It was instant. Without the blanket, the air in the cabin felt like invisible teeth biting into his skin. Ethan sat on the hard wooden floor, as close to the fire as he dared, wrapping his arms around his knees. He fed the fire, stick after stick, watching his precious wood supply dwindle. An hour passed, then two. The woman didn't move. Ethan began to shake, violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled his teeth. His fingers went numb. His toes felt like blocks of wood. The night stretched into an eternity. At one point, around 3:00 a.m., the fire burned low, and Ethan was too stiff to reach the wood quickly. The room plunged into darkness and cold so profound it felt like the bottom of the ocean. He hallucinated. He saw his father standing in the corner, shaking his head. He saw the summer sun. He felt a deceptive warmth spreading through his chest, the final stage before freezing, and he had to slap his own face, screaming silently to stay awake, to stay alive. He looked at the woman. She was sleeping peacefully now. The wool was doing its job. She was pink. She was alive. He was dying. Well, he thought, his mind sluggish and thick, at least one of us made it. Ethan passed out just as the gray light of dawn touched the window. He woke up to the smell of sage and the sound of silence. The storm had broken. He was alive, though his body felt like a single bruised nerve. He was covered. The wool blanket was draped over him. He sat up, groggy and disoriented. The Apache woman was sitting by the hearth, feeding the fire with the last of his wood. She looked at him, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a nod of recognition, of understanding. She stayed for 3 days. The snow was too deep for anyone to travel, 5 feet of powder that locked the valley in silence. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they communicated in gestures. She showed him how to make a tea from pine needles that stopped his shivering. She repaired the holes in his socks with sinew she pulled from her dress. She saw the empty larder, the dwindling wood. She knew what he had done. She knew he had almost killed himself to keep her warm. On the 4th day, the sun came out, blinding and bright. The snow settled. The woman stood at the door, pointed to the mountains, and touched her heart. She touched the blanket, then pointed to Ethan. Then she walked out into the vast white landscape, moving with a grace that defied the depth of the snow, disappearing into the tree line. Ethan was alone again, and now he was truly in trouble. He had burned almost all his wood, keeping them alive. His food was gone. He was weak. The blanket was his, but he couldn't eat wool. He sat on his porch, watching the tree line, wondering if he had just delayed the inevitable. A week passed. The silence of the mountains returned, heavier than before. Ethan was rationing dried beans, counting the days until he starved or froze. Then the ground began to tremble. It started as a vibration in his coffee cup, a ripple in the water. Then it became a sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming like distant thunder. But the sky was clear. Ethan grabbed his rifle and stumbled to the porch. They came over the ridge like a landslide. At first it looked like a dark stain spreading across the snow. Then the shapes resolved. Horses, riders, hundreds of them. Ethan's heart stopped. This wasn't a hunting party. This was an army, 200 Apache warriors, painted for war or ceremony, he didn't know which, rode into his valley. The sound of 800 hooves crunching the snow was deafening, yet the men themselves were eerily silent. They carried lances, rifles, and bows. They surrounded his cabin in a massive shifting circle, cutting off every escape route. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. The valley floor was a sea of horses and feathers and dark, judging eyes. Ethan lowered his rifle. There was no point. If they wanted him dead, he was already a ghost. He stood on his porch, shivering in his thin coat, and waited for the end. The circle parted. A single rider moved forward. He was an older man, his face a landscape of deep lines and weather-beaten skin, wearing a headdress that marked him as a chief of significant power. He rode a spotted warhorse that snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air. Next to him, on a smaller pony, sat the woman. She looked different now, strong, proud. She wore clean leathers, intricate beadwork, and fur. She pointed at Ethan and spoke rapidly to the chief in her native tongue. The chief stared at Ethan. The silence stretched for a minute, heavy enough to crush a man. Then the chief dismounted. He dropped his reins and walked through the deep snow toward the porch. He stopped 3 feet from Ethan. His eyes weren't filled with hate. They were filled with awe. "My daughter says you are the man with one blanket," the chief said, his English thick but understandable. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "I am." The chief looked at the cabin, the empty woodpile, the gaunt look on Ethan's face. "She says you have no wood because you burned it for her. She says you froze so she would not. She says you have the blanket of a rich man, but you gave it to a stranger." "She was dying," Ethan said simply. "I couldn't let that happen." The chief turned back to the army of riders and raised his hand. He shouted a single command that echoed off the granite cliffs. Suddenly, the terrifying wall of warriors dissolved into motion. They didn't attack. They dismounted. 50 men moved to the tree line with axes. Within an hour, Ethan's yard was filled with the sound of chopping. They didn't just replenish his woodpile. They built a fortress of timber that would last him 3 winters. Another group approached the porch, carrying bundles. They laid them at Ethan's feet: haunches of elk meat, smoked venison, sacks of cornmeal, dried berries. Then came the furs, buffalo robes thick and heavy, piled waist-high, soft tan deer skins, woven rugs. The chief turned back to Ethan. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a knife. The handle was carved from bone, inlaid with turquoise and silver, the blade sharp enough to shave the wind. He handed it to Ethan, handle first. "You gave my daughter your life," the chief said, his voice rumbling like the earth. "You gave your warmth when you had none to spare. This is the act of a brother. A warrior does not let his brother starve. A warrior does not let his brother freeze." The chief placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You are alone in this valley, but you are not alone in this land. When the snow melts, you will see our fires in the high peaks. You will know that the Apache watch over this house. No man, white or red, will touch you here. You are Cimarron, Wild Horse. You are family." The woman rode up then. She didn't speak, but she smiled, a brilliant, radiant smile that melted the last of the fear in Ethan's heart. She unclasped a necklace of heavy silver beads from her neck and leaned down, placing it in Ethan's hand. Without another word, the chief mounted his horse. He raised his lance, and 200 warriors raised their weapons in a silent salute that shook the air. They turned as one, a singular organism of power and grace, and rode back toward the ridge, disappearing into the blinding white of the mountains as quickly as they had come. Ethan stood on his porch, surrounded by enough wood to burn forever, enough food to feast for a year, and a promise of protection that was worth more than all the gold in Colorado. He looked down at the silver necklace in his hand, then at the heavy wool blanket on his bed inside. He had given everything he had to a stranger, expecting death. Instead, he had been given a life he never could have imagined. The valley was silent again, but it was no longer empty. The wind still blew, but it didn't feel cold anymore. Ethan Miller smiled, gripped the bone-handled knife, and walked back into his warm home. He knew that out there, in the vast wilderness, 200 brothers were watching. And that was enough. If this story of impossible kindness and unexpected reward moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the coldest times, a single act of good can change your destiny forever.